life in Egypt, isn't it very much shaped by the conflict with Israel? Two wars, the way that the military is highly respected in Egypt is as a result of those conflicts. Isn't this much more difficult to disentangle than Diane Singerman's analysis may suggest?
Yes, I mean, the relationship with Israel, I mean, Israel is very concerned with the regime change in Egypt, and these are legitimate concern from the part of Israel. However, I don't think that any new Egyptian government and the Egyptian military will engage in a war against Israel. So the Egyptian military had, after the 1973 war, the role is really defend the border, and it's not an offensive military. Its role inside the country, it was isolated from the public. Also, that's why it has the respect of the people in Egypt. And there is a need to work with the military to have a positive role in the political process, and forget about this problem with Israel, because the concerns with the relationship with Israel created a lot of concerns with the issue of regime change in Egypt. And I don't think that whoever will take office in Egypt will engage in anything foolish, because there is a fear to lose Sinai again. Sinai is demilitarized.
All right.
Yes.
Kairi Abbasa, we don't have very much time left, and I do want to raise a very important element to the way that the U.S. government and people look at Egypt before we wrap things up. Jason Brownlee, there's an extent to which people in the U.S. are afraid of regime change in Egypt because they are afraid of radical fundamentalism. The Muslim Brotherhood in particular has been raised as a kind of very frightening prospect to be involved in any future leadership. But let me put it to you that the general threat has always been rather independence. In the past, the US and its allies have, in fact, supported radical Islamists.
2 points. First, back on the Arab-Israeli peace process. This is a global concern. It's not an issue that's going to be resolved bilaterally between the U.S. and Egypt. And concerns in Egypt symptomize international worries about the lack of peace process and the need to make more substantial progress. On the fear that you rightly point out about democracy in Egypt, it's quite surprising to hear U.S. officials who speak about how much they value democracy to actually publicly acknowledge that they're not ready for it in Egypt. But it's really not their choice. Egyptians have spoken, and it's Egyptians who will chart this democratic course. But the underlying concern is not about radical Islam or abrogation of the peace treaty, both of which are, as fears, are quite overblown. I think the real anxiety has to do with dealing with the country of Egypt and its people as an equal, as a peer, about the United States no longer having a yes man in Cairo, and instead having a government that, much like Turkey, will agree with the United States on many issues, but occasionally will say, no, we have our own ideas on this, we are an independent country, and here they are.
Can you explain, Diane Singerman, why it would seem that the U.S., do you agree that the U.S. is frightened of the prospect of an independent, inverted commas, government there?
No, I don't. I think we have to listen to the aspirations of the Egyptian people. We have to stop deciding that we get to choose who win elections, and we basically let it up to the Egyptian people to decide who their leaders are.
Kairi Abbasa, a final word.
Exactly. The important thing for the United States is to support a liberal democratic process in which all ideologies can coexist and can work together. This is the only way out of this situation.
Thank you very much indeed to all our guests, Jason Brownlee, Diane Singerman and Kairi Abbasa. And thank you so much for joining us here on this edition of Inside Story. A reminder, we do always welcome your comments and suggestions. Email them to us at insidestory@aljazeera.net. Goodbye for now.
Stalemate in Liberation Square, but there are reports the Egyptian government is negotiating behind closed doors. It's got 1200 hours GMT, 2 p.m. in Egypt. This is Al Jazeera. I'm Kamal Santamaria with extended coverage on the crisis in Egypt.
The region is being battered by a perfect storm.
US Secretary of State warns other governments to implement reforms in the wake of Egypt's crisis. Also, a gas blast in Sinai, a pipeline from Egypt which supplies both Jordan and Israel, is attacked. And the government meets as it's revealed the unrest is costing Egypt more than $300 million a day. So plenty of developments in Egypt on Saturday, whilst it might be a little quieter in Liberation Square. We have heard from the US Secretary of State, who's warning other Middle Eastern leaders to take note of what is happening in Egypt. Hillary Clinton says the region is being battered by a perfect storm. Meanwhile, thousands of pro-democracy protesters spent the night in Cairo's Liberation Square. These live pictures as the crowds again swell today, listening to speeches being delivered there. People camping out after what they called a day of departure, one which failed in its bid to unseat President Hosni Mubarak. Now they'd be asking themselves what they could do to push forward this popular uprising. But as Alan Fisher reports, it comes as international pressure on the embattled Egyptian president is stepped up.
Nerves are frayed, tensions still high, strangers regarded with suspicion. The protest they hope would bring instant results is now 12 days old. They sing and chant to keep spirits high. Since dawn, the crowd in Liberation Square in Cairo has continued to grow. There is a much larger army presence on the streets now. People are stopped, identities checked. Yet still there's been fighting. The attacks away from the camera, the aftermath in full view. The crowd wanted Friday's protest to be decisive, to be President Mubarak's day of departure. He's still there and getting on with business. This was a meeting with senior cabinet members in Cairo. US Secretary of State Hillary Clinton says the Middle East is facing a perfect storm and changes have to follow.
The status quo is simply not sustainable. So